Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. The Football Game, submitted by Crispy Wisp Chris. My story happened in 2012 when I was a junior in high school. I decided I didn't want to do 3 sports that year and was focusing on wrestling and track, so my fall season was open to training and going to see my best friends play football on Fridays and Saturdays. I missed playing, but I had started this new program for wrestling that didn't work with practice times, so I had to quit. My friend Roman and I would take our girlfriends and other friends to the home games and away games, but this particular night, we went by ourselves to a road game which turned out to be a very bad idea. I had just gotten my driver's license, and my dad sold me his old F-150. It was older and pretty beat up, but man, I loved that truck. We got some Miller Lights together and drove on out to cheer on our boys at a game a few towns away from ours. For whatever reason, our girlfriends didn't want to go. We thought we'd stop somewhere on the way, have a few beers, and then go do some rabble-rousing. We got to the game a little after it started and were buzzing a bit, but not sloppy. There were a bunch of other kids from our school there, too, and we just got some snacks and then sat in the visitor bleachers. As the game went on, and our guys were up by a pretty decent score, we started in on the obnoxiousness, yelling shit at players and making fun of people in the home stands. By the 4th quarter, most of their supporters had left, but there was this one group of guys that we would just not stop razzing. They were flipping us off and saying stuff back, and honestly, I thought it was all in good humor. Wrong. Roman and I said later to our buds and went back to my truck, and we didn't notice that 5 of the guys from the group we were messing with had followed us out. When I got to my truck, I was laughing about something and opened my door, and that's when one of the guys, a real big motherfucker, came running up and kicked my door shut and said, "You got something to say now, asshole?" I just stood there for a second and said, "Dude, relax." Another guy stepped up and said, "I'm going to do some relaxing on your face," which to this day I don't know what that means. Anyway, 3 other guys were now over by Roman, and interestingly enough, one was saying for everyone to just take it easy. I said the same thing, and we were just joking around, and Roman apologized earnestly, saying we were just having some fun. Everyone kind of stood there for a while. We got into my truck and I started to drive away. One of the guys picked up a piece of broken blacktop and whipped it at my rear window, and it smashed. I stomped on the brakes, and Roman said, "There's 5 of them, man. I know you're a tough guy, but let's just get out of here." As much as I wanted to get into some shit, I smartly drove off thinking I'd just call Safelite or whatever and get my window fixed. So we drove off, but it was literally less than 5 minutes later. We were driving down a 2-lane road when lights from behind us came up flying. For a second I thought it was the cops, but I could see that it was another pickup truck. I said to Roman, "I think these assholes are following us." And he looked back and then started texting people. That's when the middle window of my truck shattered and something went through my windshield. One of these guys had shot at us. We both instinctively ducked, and Roman immediately got on 911 as they continued to follow us. Because of their lights on us, I couldn't really get a good description of the truck, and there was no front license plate. That I knew. 911 kept talking to Roman, and I sped up and started making a bunch of turns to get away from these guys, and then 911 said to stop doing that, but I was freaking the fuck out. Finally, after what we thought was another shot, I did something totally crazy and spun the wheel, went up an off-ramp onto an interstate, just taking my chances. There was no one coming down, thank God, and these guys didn't follow. There was one last shot that I do know that hit my tailgate, as evidence proved later when we looked. The road wasn't that busy, so I just blasted over the median, turned around, and got back on the right side of the road without putting anyone else into jeopardy. I floored it while Roman told 911 where we were now, and they said to stop as soon as we could. We did, and by our yelling about gunfire throughout the whole call, they sent 3 cars out after us. I was shaking with fear and anger, and so was Roman. The Stadies were really cool, and obviously had a ton of questions for us, and we were straight with them about everything. Long story short, some asshole yahoos shot at us over some goofing around, and the Stadies couldn't find them as we couldn't really give them a good description of anything. These guys got away with it. And the long end of it, I got my truck fixed up. The bullet hole was still in the tailgate after the police extracted the bullet, and I vowed to not run my mouth again with any strangers I would ever run into. Totally crazy night that ended with a lesson learned, and some crazy motherfuckers getting away. High-End Neighbors Don't Guarantee Safety by Returning Videotapes 2. This happened around 10 years ago in the south of the UK. For reference, I'm a 28-year-old male, and at the time I was working part-time at a fuel station on an A road which linked a small village to a ring road into the nearby city. The village itself was quiet, high-end, and extremely expensive to live in. It was the sort of place that only had one chain store, and it was a Whalrose. Everything else was either boutiques or privately owned gourmet grocers. So, as someone who has always enjoyed cars, it was always fun to see what kind of high-end luxury sports cars would adorn the forecourt on any given day. This is where I met Michael. Michael was in his late 40s. Dark hair, well-dressed. Always wore Grant or Ralph Lauren on his workdays, tailored Canali suits, etc. He was an all-around nice guy. Exceptionally polite, which was actually ranty, as most of the residents of the surrounding area seemed to despise anyone who didn't qualify for the additional tax bracket. We got chatting about his collection of vehicles or the watches he wore. He'd always show up wearing some kind of Rolex and driving his Aston Martin, Range Rover, or Porsche, so there was always a lot to talk about. I got to know that he worked in finance, and the conversation got on to what I was planning to do with my life, which was also to work in finance. We'd always have these pleasant conversations until I left that part-time job in favor for taking up an apprenticeship role at my uncle's brokerage. Michael is important, and we'll get to why shortly. Something to be known about my uncle is that he's a man with a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, literally. As well as his brokerage and property portfolio, he also owned a few takeaways for cash flow purposes. I think we all know what that means, and as such I'd occasionally step in as a delivery driver when a driver would let him down. Luckily, my uncle also lived in the previously mentioned village, and the main pizza place he owned catered to the residents of said village. Tips were usually quite decent, and my uncle would usually throw me a few quid for helping out. Fast forward to summer 2008, and I've been roped into dropping off a few pies at a property on an extremely prestigious road. Average house price was well above $1.4 million, and I was intrigued to actually get close enough to see what those houses looked like, as they're all gated and set far back from the road behind a shroud of trees and shrubs. So I find the place and buzz the intercom, when a voice comes back sort of muffled, just saying, "Yes?" So I answered with the name of the takeaway, and the gate slowly opened, and I made my way up the driveway to a very large mock Georgian home, complete with detached 4-car garage. And that's when I see Michael's number plates. He had his initials for his cars, with numbers 1, 2, and 3, and it was the same for his wife. I was interested to see up close the sort of life this guy had, and if I'm completely honest, especially as a young financer. I exited my car, brought out the pizzas, and the double doors opened, and that's when I saw an unfamiliar face looking back at me. It was a man, early 20s maybe, thin, shaved head. I can remember he was wearing no shirt and some scruffy jeans and trainers. He was also holding something behind his back. "Hey, bring the pizzas through to the kitchen." I can remember his voice being hoarse and barely audible, with an accent I'd never heard. Nervously, I said nothing and just looked at him, which made him visibly angry. "Bring the pizza through," he repeated, more aggressive this time, and I finally responded. "Where's Michael? This is Michael's place, right?" And it is completely true that in situations like this, your mouth goes completely dry, and to always follow your gut. This guy was setting off alarm bells and telling every fiber in my being to just get off the property. Unfortunately, this is when it dawned upon me that it is a gated property, and I was locked in. This is when things went from bad to worse. I can remember the terror swelling up inside of me when he moved his hand in front of him to show me a large kitchen knife and uttered the word, "Run." I dropped the pizza onto the gravel, left my car, and decided I'd have a better chance of survival by running down the driveway and lifting myself over the gates. They were the wooden type, which had no decorative spears atop them, luckily, but all the while I could hear his feet crunching onto the gravel behind me. I didn't look back, and managed to pull myself up and over the gates, hurl myself over to the pavement beneath me. The adrenaline in my system still had me running for what seemed like hours, but was perhaps 10 minutes at most, until I was a good few streets away, and that's when I decided to call the police. Police met me at the park I was hiding at, and one officer stayed with me, and the other proceeded to the property along with another patrol car. At first I got the distinct impression that they didn't believe me or thought I was up to something, but after my uncle arrived to pick me up and vouched for me being sent there to deliver pizza, the PC in question backed down. Upon their arrival at the property, they found nothing, just my car with slashed tires, broken windows, alongside feces being smeared across part of the kitchen. There was food strewn about the place, and also a needle found in one of the bathrooms, but no sign of the man who threatened me. Michael and his family at the time were visiting family in Australia, I later found out. I never did go back for another shift at the pizza place, and although I understand this might be the most crazy or horrifying encounter, wealth and apparent financial security is just completely illusory. People are people, and there are some sick and tormented people out there who will always find a way to carry out their twisted actions. And if anything, I've had more encounters with crazy people since moving away with my council estates roots and into suburbia. The Caves, submitted by Renee. During your live stream, I mentioned about my trip to New York State near Albany. The place I was talking about was Schoharie, approximately 70 kilometers west from Albany. We went there in the early 2000s with my college outdoors club. We were in about 5 different cave systems, and there was one cave in particular that got very tight and wet. We ended up hiding our cameras behind a rock and continued going deeper to a cavern that had been an underground waterfall. On the way back, I was the last one of my group, and my headlamp went dead. I yelled out to the group that I had no light and started to replace the batteries, but the problem was with the lamp and not the batteries. I used my little flashlight to continue to the upcoming cavern where I thought the rest of the group waited for me, but no one was there, and the cave had 3 split-offs. I couldn't remember which one we had come out of when we came in, so I sat there in the near darkness, and all I could hear was my heart racing. I was lost with hardly any water, with a good 20 to 40 feet of rocks and soil over my head with a quickly dimming flashlight. I just sat there in a near panic mode and was yelling for help 10 to 15 minutes until someone finally noticed me missing and turned around. The funny thing was this: we were not alone. When we got to the area where we had left our cameras, and these were old-fashioned film cameras and one new state-of-the-art camera with the old 3.5 megapixels, someone found our hiding space, stole the cameras. They did, however, remove the memory cards and one of the films that was finished, wrapped them in a cloth, and put them in a Ziploc bag. The Devil's Nest by Wicked Scissors 17. My husband Sean and I, as newlyweds, relocated to a little house in Weber City, Virginia. This was in January of 2014, and we were so excited to move into this house as we were leasing to own. My mom assisted us in the move, and we couldn't have been more prouder of being homeowners. It was such a beautiful little starter home, and it was located practically at the base of a mountain in the woods, located on the Trail of Tears. Within the first week, the activity began. I was training as a CNA at a local nursing home in the area, and I got up early one morning as I had been for my classes. It was around 5:30 in the morning, and I was in the bathroom blow-drying my hair with the door open. It was a small bathroom, so I left the door open so I wouldn't get hot. As I held my head upside down and tousled my hair in the dryer around, I caught a glimpse of someone in an old-timey pioneer woman dress float directly next to me into my bedroom. Confused and not understanding what I had just seen, I stopped what I was doing and walked into the bedroom where my husband was still sleeping. I couldn't explain what had just happened, and I was at a total loss for words. I mentioned what had happened to friends and family, and most just laughed. When I told my mother, she mentioned to me that the house next door had been on a paranormal television show at one point, and supposedly it was known for being an extremely haunted place. I laughed it off and didn't think much of it. I was wrong to ever act so nonchalant. We found out we were pregnant with our firstborn, Harper, shortly after we moved into the home. Things were great for a while. We had a baby on the way. I decided to take time off and stay home while pregnant. One night I remember my husband had went to sleep before me, and I was sitting in the living room watching TV. We had 3 dogs at the time, and I whistled for them to come out of the bedroom and come into the living room with me. I whistled, and all of a sudden, I heard a whistle right back. I got up and walked to the bedroom to see if my husband was awake, and he was fast asleep. I got that eerie feeling like someone was watching me, and I stayed up most of the night. There were many moments in the home where you would hear people speaking in the house, but very low. I can only explain like it was in a diner and how it can be during an early morning rush, multiple conversations just going on nonstop. We would hear it all through the night whenever we laid in bed and attempted to sleep. I'll say right now, my husband was a bit of a skeptic prior to living in this house. You could also lay in our bed at night and see shadows speed from the dining room to the living room. It got to be quite disturbing at night when we were just laying down and just thought our eyes were playing tricks on us. The activity was fairly frequent, but nothing too extreme at first. Now, I know seeing someone walk by me is pretty extreme, but not when you lived in this house. Eventually, we got pregnant again with Charlotte and became a family of 4. My husband's cousin Thomas needed a place to stay and moved in with us. We joked with him about the house next door being haunted and told him about the weird things that occurred in our home. My husband, being the practical joker that he is, thought it'd be funny to buy a satanic Bible and read and poke fun at the things in it. That's just the way he is. He likes to taunt people or things on occasion. One night, he decided he'd go next door and summon whatever was in that house to come to him. No one was living in the home at that time, and usually the residents didn't last longer than a few months. As soon as he got done summoning whatever was in that house, he became violently ill and ran back home getting sick in our yard. And after that, things went downhill. There were times when you could go outside and see the light randomly come on upstairs in the house next door, and no one was there. We knew this because my husband and his friend went over to find out if someone was there. I knocked for a while, and no one came to the door. They came back to the porch, and then the light went off. It was so strange. We went back to our house and came back out to smoke about 30 minutes later, and the light came back on. We would see shadows outside all the time as well. So much of this just kept going on and on. After the satanic Bible incident, my husband, myself, and the girls were asleep in bed. I remember waking up feeling someone's hands touching me inappropriately, and I thought it was my husband. I remember just laughing and saying, "Oh, stop." But then I opened my eyes and was looking at him, and both of the girls were laying on and against him. I immediately froze in fear and went catatonic. I I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything. I remember feeling the tears running down my face, and with everything in me, I knew someone was behind me. It's like I was screaming in my head for my husband to wake up, but nothing came out. Finally, it was like whatever was touching me released me, and I shot up crying. I was so shook by that moment. I had never had anything like that happen to me. I felt so violated. My husband, being my husband, just laughed and assumed that I had been dreaming, and poked fun at me about it. I labeled the next incident as the big night, because it was just that. One night, my husband, his cousin, and myself were hanging out. The girls were already in bed. We were up late, and it was so cold outside, I remember having to wear a jacket when I went outside and smoke, and I could see my breath, it was that cold. I came back in from the back porch after smoking, and looked out my dining room window towards the haunted house. In the yard they had a concrete table and bench, and to my surprise, in the freezing cold, there were 3 people sitting at the table with a lantern lit over their head. There was a tall man, and his face was so distorted I couldn't make it out, but he was wearing overalls and kept shaking oddly. A dark blonde woman and an old woman in a long black robe or dress was also with him. I wouldn't have thought about it being too strange, but the lantern was just hanging in mid-air from nothing, and it was freezing cold outside, and they were just sitting there. I shouted for my husband and his cousin, another skeptic, and they were both shocked and in disbelief. We couldn't believe our eyes, and I ran to the back porch and looked at the table, and no one was there. I thought I was going crazy. I ran back inside, and they were there again. I ran to my front porch, and I could still see them. Again, back to the back porch, and they were gone. It's like the only place I could see them was from my dining room and the front porch. My husband's cousin Thomas was in shock and refused to look anymore. He went back into the living room, scared of what he was seeing. I remember asking him, "Are you seeing this? The same thing that I'm seeing?" And he replied, "Yes, but I don't want to admit it to myself." I waved at the people sitting there, and they waved back. I did this frequently throughout the night until finally around 4 a.m., the blonde female flipped me off. At around 6 a.m., they disappeared, and it was the craziest thing I had ever seen. I'd never seen anything like it since. One day, the woman that owned the house next door came over and asked my husband if he could help change the locks on it, because new people were moving in. He went over and helped her, and she proceeded to tell them that her brother had lived in the house and practiced stuff in the occult that was into some pretty heavy stuff. He had Parkinson's and always wore overalls. My husband immediately thought of the man we'd seen that night sitting at the table outside. She then told him her brother shot himself upstairs in the middle of a pentagram. My husband became very disturbed by this, and we both swear it was her brother we saw that night, sitting at that table outside. We lived there for a few years, and it was almost like the place was draining our relationship, turning us against one another and causing severe damage to our marriage. We decided to part ways, and I relocated to North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, to be closer to my mother, who had moved down a year after I moved into that house. And leaving that house was the best decision we ever made. My husband and I reconciled and are happier than ever here in South Carolina with both of our girls. One night, we were watching TV, and the show pops up on Hulu called Paranormal State. An episode labeled The Devil's Nest comes on. We began watching, and we were shocked by what we were seeing as they drove up our old road, our old hill, and you could see our house as they pulled into the driveway of the house next door and began their investigation of the Devil's Nest. My husband was in shock and stated that this just put everything together he'd experienced, because he'd written it off as he was going crazy. One scene in the show, the resident states she was sexually assaulted by something there, and that made things just come together for me. My husband was at that point in shock and dismayed by what had actually happened to me. we both feel for whoever lives in either house because we don't feel like it's the houses. We feel like it's the land, and it has a permanent stain that will never be lifted. I'm so glad we moved away from there, but we will always remember the horrible and shocking events that happened while we were living there. The Woman in White of Eaton's Tunnel, submitted by Marva Binks. In Waverly, West Virginia is Mountwood Park. The park is made up of a bunch of trails, and there's also a campground on site, but us locals know it better as the home of Eaton's Tunnel. Eaton's Tunnel, or Tunnel Number 21, was part of a railway that ran from the 1850s to the 1960s that is now abandoned and used partially as a walking trail. Now, the tunnel we walk through today was not the original Tunnel 21, because in 1963, the original tunnel was destroyed in a rockfall, killing 2 men, and as far as I've heard, their bodies were never recovered. There have been many deaths on the railroad tracks during the time of its operation, but the deaths of these 2 men are the most well known to locals. The new tunnel was built right next to the original, and if you venture up into the woods at the end of the new tunnel, you can find the ruins of the original one, but all that's left of the entrance is a hole about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide that you can fit in if you're small enough. I personally have only been inside of the original tunnel once, but that's a story for another time. The story I have today involves the lesser-known spirit that is referred to as the Woman in White. To be honest with you, I don't really know the legend of the Woman in White except for her being hit in the tunnel by an oncoming train way back when. They say she has long dark hair and wears a white dress and gold shoes. Personally, I'm very sensitive to the paranormal and have been for as long as I can remember. However, those Woman in White Bloody Mary type stories have always come off as bullshit to me. But now that you've been filled in on some of the history, it's time for me to share how I became a believer of the Woman in White of Eaton's Tunnel. My story took place on January 11th of 2020. It was a full moon, and my husband Alex, our friend group, and I decided if we wanted to see anything spooky at the tunnel, the full moon would be our best opportunity. Our group consisted of Alex, Andrew, Casey, Joey, Lakota, and me being the only girl. Joey and Casey practiced Wicca and stressed to us that being there around midnight wouldn't be safe, not only because of the witching hour, but the full moon and the likely possibility that dangerous people could be there practicing their own fucked up rituals. That being said, we were more so scared of the real people that could be out there rather than any supernatural entities we'd potentially come across. So we armed ourselves with pocket knives and my stun gun, along with blessed symbols of the Tree of Life for each of us. We arrived to the makeshift parking area at about 10 p.m. And from there, it's about a half-mile walk to get to the opening of the tunnel. The light of the full moon illuminated the trail enough to where we didn't need to use our flashlights to guide the way. We walked down the muddy trail, telling each other to watch our step as to not fill our shoes with water since it was winter, and the last thing any of us needed to do was catch a cold from freezing wet feet. Before you get to the opening of the tunnel, the trail comes to a curve in the thick trees, so in the dark you don't really see the tunnel until you're about 50 feet from the entrance. We were going around the curve, talking and not really paying attention, when Joey and Lakota, who were in the front of the group, stopped dead in their tracks and told us to stop. Joey said, "What the fuck is that?" We all looked what they were staring at, and I swear to God, we had just come face to face with Samara from the Ring. In the moonlight stood an apparition of not a woman, but a girl in what looked like a light-colored nightgown with long dark hair that hid any of her facial features. I was so taken aback that I didn't think to see if she wore golden shoes like the legend says. I nudged Alex and said, "Please tell me you can see her too," as he is usually my voice of reason. He quickly said, "Yeah, I can see her. Shh." His face was covered in fear and confusion, and I had never seen him scared like this before. I can't remember who out of the bunch booked it a few yards back with us, but 2 members of our group stayed still in their spots. When we looked back at them, they were looking back at us and said something along the lines of, "She's not going to hurt us. She's just lonely." We slowly walked back up to them, unsure of what to say or do, because she was still fucking standing there, not moving an inch. We had just gotten there, and we didn't want to drive all the way out there for nothing, so together we mustered up all of our courage and started walking forward. We noticed that the closer we got, the girl became more translucent until about 20 feet in, she vanished completely. As soon as this happened, Joey started to cry. He said he felt overcome with remorse for the girl and insisted on standing at the opening of the tunnel and saying a few words for the girl we had seen. I couldn't hear much of what he said other than, "I'm so sorry for whatever happened to you, but you haven't been forgotten." But once he was done, he looked back at us and said, "It's okay, guys, we can go in." We all made it through the tunnel without any more incidents, and on the way back through started discussing going to the abandoned church on a hill on the other side of the park. We got back to the entrance of the tunnel and started back down to the trail to the car when all of a sudden I was overcome with this immense feeling of dread. Something was wrong, and I became fucking terrified, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. The only person in the group who realized I had stopped was Lakota, and he came over to stand next to me, asking if I was okay. I told him something felt wrong, and I could sense something bad, almost malicious around us. We started walking again, and we could both hear movement behind us. We kept looking back, but never saw anything. About 3/4 of the way back to the car, my back started to burn, and in my head I was saying to myself, "No fucking way, I think I know what's happening," thinking back to Casey telling me the story of how when he came out here back in high school, something had scratched his back. I took off my backpack, unzipped my Columbia jacket, and told Lakota to shine his flashlight on my back. He complied as I lifted the back of my shirt and said, "Marley, did you scratch your back?" And I'm telling you, I have never felt a pit in my stomach deeper than the one that I had that moment. Not only was I wearing a backpack, but I was also wearing 2 shirts and a hoodie under my tightly zipped Columbia to fight off the cold of the winter. It wouldn't have been easy for me to reach my back to scratch it, especially in that spot where the scratches were located. I told him to take a picture of it so I could see, and sure enough, 2 lines were beginning to welt in the middle of my back. I started freaking out a bit, mostly annoyed that whatever did this would target me when the rest of the boys came back to check on me. I showed them my back, and they were at a loss for words other than, "Let's just get the hell out of here." We got in the car and wound up going to the abandoned church, but I couldn't shake what had just happened to me, and it made me extra jittery while exploring the small shell that was left of the church. After a few minutes of looking around, we went home and didn't really discuss any of the expedition any further. I've gone back to the tunnel a few times since, but nothing comparable to what we experienced that night has happened again. My husband and I are huge fans of your channel, so thank you for taking time to read our story and for sharing it if you decide to. And to the girl in white, let's not meet again. The Face in My Window, submitted by Francis T. When I moved into my first apartment after high school, I lived with my friend I'll call Casey. It was an apartment complex in a Texas suburb I won't mention, and we had a ground floor unit, which at first was nice because we could park right out front, bring in groceries and stuff without having to walk up flights of stairs. We also had a back patio that was fenced in. There was a door on that, so it was easy to get in and out of our place. The problem was, there was some sort of halfway house about 2 miles away, and it was full of people who had been let out of prison and lived there as they tried, and I stress the word tried, to get their lives back together. I'm not busting on anyone. I know a lot of people make mistakes and want to just get back to living, but my story is about someone who was not like that. One spring night, Casey and I had some friends over to barbecue some chicken and to sit on our patio and have a few adult cocktails and enjoy an evening. Her boyfriend, I'll call Brett, had brought over a guy I'd met once before, and I'll call him Derek. We were both going to a community college, not the same classes, but I liked him and vice versa. He was in criminal justice, and while it kind of made me nervous, he always had a gun on him. And that was a good thing this night. The four of us were sitting there at a little table after we ate and were playing euchre, Derek and I cheating the entire time, crossboarding. We had a little cooler with a bunch of Shiner Box in it, and I went to get one and saw someone standing outside the wooden fence of our patio. At first, I thought he was a neighbor, but when I said, "Hey," the person ran away. Derek and Brett got up and looked up and down the parking lot, but they said that there was no one there. We got back to our game and laughing about all kinds of funny stories we were sharing, and then I looked over and I saw a shape standing there again. While we had a light on the building above our patio, there were also lights in the parking lot, so I couldn't make out any face or anything, just the shape of someone standing there. I said out loud, "He's back," and the guys jumped up very fast, but whoever it was already running away towards the main street. Derek chased him, but he couldn't catch up. After a few minutes, he got back, and we just decided to go inside. I remember we watched a creepy movie called Insidious, which is pretty scary if you've never watched it. I got up to get my phone charger in my bedroom, and when I looked out my window into the back, Casey's bedroom was at the front of our place near the front door and hallway of the complex. Mine was at the back near the patio. I saw a man standing with his hands on the window looking in. I screamed, and everyone came running, and I bumped into them as I was running away. Sorry, I'm kind of a chicken. Brett and Derek ran over to the window, but there was no one there. I said I was calling the police and did. They didn't really do much except ask if I knew who it was and to call back if he showed up again. Yeah, thanks a bunch. We all went to the kitchen for a snack and another beer, and Derek looked at me and in the sweetest way said, "Do you mind if I stay here tonight? I don't like that there's a guy hanging around. I mean, I can sleep on the couch or the floor or whatever, but I don't think I should leave." He was such a sweetheart. I said I would like that, and after hanging out for a while, Casey and Brett went to her room, and I asked Derek to come to mine. After getting ready for bed, we snuggled up and kissed for a long time. Then he sat up and looked at the window, and there was the guy again, but now he was holding up something that looked like a knife. Derek whispered to me, "Don't move." And he got up and stretched like he was acting like he didn't know that anything was going on. He said loudly that he wanted another beer and left the room, and then I could hear him running to the back. This time, the guy didn't have a chance to take off, and Derek jumped on him and started telling him to not move and yelled for one of us to call the police. I did, and of course half the complex came out because of all the yelling, and we all saw Derek on top of this guy. He had his knee on his neck, and Derek yelled for me to tell the police that he had a gun on him, but was not the bad guy. So I did. The police got there in a short while and told Derek to back off before getting the guy up and put into a car. They asked us what happened, and here's the sick part. The guy didn't have any pants on. He had been playing with himself outside my window. He was a guy from the halfway house who had been a child sex offender and was not supposed to be over here at all. He had not gone to his job at the nearby United. People were already looking for him, so freaking gross. The police took him away, picked up a butter knife outside my window, and then they threw his pants into the trunk of their car. We said we wanted to press charges for him peeping in on us, and the police said okay, but they also assured us that he was in more trouble for breaking the rules of his release. Everyone went back inside. I had another makeout session with Derek because I was so worked up and I just could not believe that he'd saved me that night. We dated for a year, but sadly he joined the service and was killed overseas 2 years later. We had broken up by then, but I loved him and thank him for his service, but most of all, for protecting me and loving me back. Rest in peace, Derek. Hey gang, thanks for checking out this volume of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. Hope you enjoyed it. Working on another volume of UFO and alien stories, so if you've got anything like that, send it my way. And of course, any other stories that you have of a true scary story nature, email Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And look for some stuff on my Patreon page if you are a member of that. I'm not doing so much with that right now because I don't really want a lot of people sending me money that they might not have in this crazy time. Take care of yourselves and don't worry about this. Everybody, be excellent to each other. And until next time, remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.